It's one of the oldest youth organizations in North America, founded on tradition and trust.
To help other people at all times.
To help other people at all times.
But for years, few people knew the Boy Scouts were keeping a secret list. What was kept from Canadian parents, and who paid the price?
He would grab me in the sleeping bag, naked to naked. I said, no, this is not right.
The fight to get the secrets into the open, south of the border.
Their primary concern was protecting the organization, and so they covered it up.
Were you ever surprised you didn't get caught sooner?
Yeah.
And the questions it raises here in Canada.
Miss Yale, I'm Diana Swain from CBC. Can I have a minute of your time? Welcome to the Fifth Estate. I'm Diana Swain. For a century, it's been seen as the perfect marriage between childhood and the outdoors, Boy Scouts. But for years, Scouting executives have struggled with a sickening problem in their ranks, a problem documented in confidential files. Tonight, in this co-production with the Los Angeles Times, we'll show you how a well-intentioned idea to protect young boys sometimes succeeded only in keeping what had happened to them under wraps. A secret list that became a list of secrets.
The serenity of the British Columbia coast is about to be broken. With sleeping bags and tents in tow, Scouts have gathered from around the country for a massive camping trip. About 80,000 Canadian kids are involved in Scouting, drawn as they have been for a century by Scouting's connection to the outdoors.
To do my duty to God and the Queen.
To do my duty to God and the Queen.
Jamborees like this are a big deal, and BC's Lieutenant Governor is on hand to welcome the troops.
I hereby declare 2011 Pacific Jamboree officially open.
But the very thing that makes Scouting unique has also made it vulnerable. And what happened away from watchful eyes has left Scouts Canada with a troubling past. But what did it do with what it knew, and when? Because the Boy Scouts of America waited too long to reveal their secrets and are now paying the price.
I appreciate you guys coming in. And,
Tim Kosnoff is a Seattle lawyer who specializes in cases of sexual abuse. And these days, many of his clients are former American Boy Scouts, including this 17-year-old.
Are you afraid to walk into a courtroom and testify in front of a jury as to what happened?
No, because I know what happened and it's wrong. It's wrong what happened.
If this case drags on for 2 years, you'll see it through to the end?
I'll see it through to the end for the people that have been abused and for people that are being abused, you know? It doesn't need to happen. It really doesn't.
Thank you for that.
And I'll be behind you there.
All right.
I will. You don't have to go through any of it alone.
They are drawn to Kosnoff because he's one of the men who finally got the Boy Scouts of America to reveal what they'd been hiding.
Knowledge carries with it responsibility. And you cannot play ostrich if you're the Boy Scouts of America and stick your head in the sand and pretend that you don't know what you know.
For Kosnoff, it began with the case of Matt and Tom Stewart, two brothers who had years earlier been Boy Scouts. The boys grew up in a suburb near Seattle in the 1970s. The tidy homes and breathtaking views gave no hint of what the boys were living through. Their assistant scoutmaster promised them days of adventure. Instead, they endured years of sexual abuse at his home, only steps from their own, beginning when Matt was barely out of kindergarten.
My first experience was with a balding guy that that when I was 6 that, you know, I could absolutely throw up over. And so, so it's horrifying, it's absolutely horrifying.
He often molested them in a tent on his lawn. Their parents believed he was helping them work toward their badges. The abuse went on for more than a decade.
Years and years and years of being controlled by this individual, and I still have nightmares to this day.
It was only as adults the men had the courage to step forward. But it's not only their abuser they blamed. They sued Boy Scouts of America, believing it too was responsible for what happened to them, because the organization knew it could be a magnet for pedophiles.
I could see that it was really a very fertile opportunity for child molesters to gain access to boys under really unique circumstances where they could get them alone, earn their trust, typically out in the woods, away from parents, overnight.
Kosnoff knew the Boy Scouts kept a secret list of men kicked out of scouting. But it was only when he stumbled across an old newspaper article written in the 1930s, quoting the chief Boy Scout at the time, that he realized just what was in those files.
And he goes on to describe the fact that the Boy Scouts have had an unfortunate experience with sexual deviants and perverts infiltrating scouting, getting access to boys.
Kosnoff discovers the practice of keeping the list is still going on and begins a campaign to get it. But the Scouts will fight him every step of the way in a legal battle that stretches years and is finally decided by the Washington State Supreme Court. It rules that for the first time in its history, Boy Scouts of America will have to hand over all the files. It's only then Kosnoff learns why Scouts fought so hard to keep them secret.
The truth was that they knew. They knew that they had been infiltrated by pedophiles systemically for almost a century. And they could no longer hide from the truth. It was all there in black and white in their files. They kept the evidence of their guilt, of their knowledge, of their responsibility.
Kosnoff discovered there are thousands of names in what the Boy Scouts had labeled the perversion files, which also recorded the horrific details of alleged abuse of Scouts. The Boy Scouts of America have had millions of volunteers over the years, but the files reveal a staggering reality. According to Kosnoff's calculations, from 1991 to 2005, 2,500 leaders were thrown out over allegations of sexual abuse, their names entered into the perversion files, an average of 1 every 2 days. And the files disclose something else.
That the Boy Scouts routinely did not notify the police when they became aware of child molesters, that their primary concern was protecting the organization, and so they covered it up.
The files are still sealed from the public, but for the first time, Kosnoff can use them to build his case. When we come back, the list reveals a Canadian name in files kept secret until now.
And he looked at me and said, "You do realize you've been kidnapped, don't you?"
Boys will be boys.
For decades, Boy Scouts of America has been viewed as one of the most respected and most trusted youth organizations. Who would have guessed it was sitting on a list of terrible secrets that have been kept hidden for decades? The names of Scout leaders it suspected were pedophiles and had quietly kicked out. It's 1971 near Victoria, and a fast car has just arrived to pick up a young boy. The man behind the wheel is Richard Turley, a local Boy Scout leader. His new recruit is 9-year-old Joey Day. It's difficult to picture him now as he was then, a shy boy looking for a chance to meet some new friends.
Mom said, "Well, okay, do you want it? Would you be interested in going?" I thought, playing with other kids and doing something different, being out of the house would be a good thing.
But the fun is short-lived. Pretty soon they aren't going to scout meetings at all. His scout leader has different plans.
What did you know about sex at that time?
Nothing. I hadn't even found myself yet. I didn't know anything, period. I knew you had a penis, I had a penis, but that was pretty much it.
Swimming lessons become a pretense for sexual gains. An impressionable Joey, desperate to please, does as he's told.
Swim in our shorts, take our shorts off, swim in the raw, and he's funneling me under the water, okay, which I didn't, you know.
And was it under the pretense of horsing around?
Horsing around, exactly, yeah, horseplay in the water. So after, I believe it was the 4th time we were at the lake, we went back to his apartment, and it was after that night that I woke up in the morning, my rear end was sore, period.
Joey is abused, often several times a week, for more than a year. He tells no one, believing his scout leader, who assures him this is something that happens to all little boys, that every man has a special friend.
I went out fishing with my father once, and I asked him, I said, who's your special friend? And he goes, what are you talking about? I explained Rick Turley to him, right? Well, he beat the shit out of me, put me up in the bow of the boat, brought me home, threw me in a hot bath, and he says, you ever say fucking anything about anything, he says, I'll beat your fucking self to death.
Like most organizations in the 1970s, Scouts Canada didn't have any formal screening for its volunteers. Leaders were referred by word of mouth, and apparently no one in Scouting suspected what happened to Joey. It won't be the last time an adult misses a chance to stop Richard Turley from molesting young Scouts. But what happens next is so brazen and so public, it catapults him into the headlines, making it seem impossible that Richard Turley could ever be allowed in Scouting again. It's 1975, 2 years after molesting Joey Day. Turley is back behind the wheel, and this time he's stolen a car. He's made his way from BC to California, and while camping, bumps into a scout troop.
He had badges all over the place. He had his Canadian scouting book. It was impressive to a kid.
Eddie Iris is just 11 years old, a Canadian kid living in California, when he meets Richard Turley. Eddie's parents are quickly put at ease by the scout leader, who offers to show their son the sights of Disneyland. Instead, he straps Eddie into a small plane and, without a word to anyone, takes off.
He says, you've been kidnapped. You realize this, don't you?
Did you think he was kidding?
No, that's when I first started to worry.
That's because Richard Turley has found a new boy to call his special friend.
His little friend, a euphemism for?
His lover. Sex slave. I don't know how else you would think of it. That was his intention.
With some old pistols and maps at his side, Turley steals a small plane and charts a course for Canada, telling Eddie they're going to live together.
A little panic set in. I thought, the door is on my side of the plane. Now that he's told me I'm kidnapped, how is he going to land this plane without worrying about what I'm going to say or do?
Eddie convinces his kidnapper to let him handle the controls, assuring him his father has taught him the basics of flying. He waits until Turley is distracted, consulting his maps, and then Eddie does the only thing he can think of. He slowly starts turning the plane around.
And turned it in a way that you couldn't feel the plane move. It was a very wide turn.
Eddie's gamble pays off. They're nearly out of fuel, and a panicked Turley radios a mayday. Police are already searching for Eddie, and they're waiting as the plane lands. Richard Turley has finally been caught.
I consider myself very lucky. I hear that some of his other victims weren't quite so lucky.
The improbable story of Eddie's return is big news in the California papers. Richard Turley is convicted of child stealing, labeled a mentally disordered sex offender, and committed to the Patton State Mental Hospital. Police files obtained by the Los Angeles Times and the Fifth Estate show the Boy Scouts of America knew all about it because they helped in the search for Eddie. They also knew Turley was a Canadian. Of course, we know the Boy Scouts of America had a system to keep men like Turley out. They called it the Perversion Files, a secret list they'd been keeping for decades of pedophiles thrown out of scouting. But incredibly, no one adds Turley's name, which means there's nothing to stop him from finding a way back into scouting. 2 years later, and the Scouts need someone to run the summer programs at their camp in the hills near San Diego. It's barely an hour's drive from the Patton State Mental Hospital. And no one realizes the new program director, Richard Turley, has recently been released after an 18-month stay.
This is the Lost Valley Boy Scout camp in Southern California. It is kilometers away from anything else. For several years in the late 1970s, a Canadian Scout leader would come down here in the summer. In 1979, on the last day of camp, he approached the families of 3 boys and asked if the boys could stay one more night and he'd bring them back the next morning. Then when everyone was gone in this isolated place, the boys say he molested them. And when he brought them back the next morning, one of the boys promptly told his father what had happened.
After a stay in a mental hospital, a court designation as a sex offender, and fresh allegations of abuse, someone finally starts an effort to keep Richard Turley out of scouting. The Fifth Estate has discovered this entry in the Boy Scouts of America's Perversion Files, created in 1979 about Richard Turley. It refers to an unfortunate incident at the camp. The files explain that Turley was confronted and confessed. The boy's parents say they won't go to police if the Boy Scouts assure them he will never be allowed in scouting again. His name is added to the Perversion Files. The official line is that Turley has left camp to deal with a family emergency. As he makes his way across the border, Turley discovers yet again that the self-interest of conflicted adults may be his best protection.
Driven out of California, Richard Turley came right back to Canada, here to Victoria, and incredibly, right back to scouting. In no time at all, he was scout leader for a new group of unsuspecting boys.
These would be the cubs at camp.
In the 1980s, Jean Bidens was hearing nothing but good things about the new leader. She was the volunteer parent in charge of a scout troop in Victoria.
He had just arrived and everybody was singing his praises and saying he's a great leader.
People are impressed by his experience and his stories about scouting in California.
We've got this very involved man who he's not a parent, he's just like, he's involved in scouting, he wants to, and he's very active and he wants to do a lot with the boys.
Jason Davies was 11 years old when he met his new scout leader, Richard Turley.
And what attracted us was the fun that we had, the camping that we did. We got to get badges, we had a sash.
In the 1980s, Scouts Canada still wasn't doing any comprehensive screening of its volunteers. So no one discovered Turley already had a conviction in California and had been labeled a sex offender, or that he'd spent considerable time in a mental facility. He's in the Boy Scouts of America's secret perversion files, but no one in Victoria was warned.
If a group committee chairperson had known that, well, even if the regional people had known that, or I would have thought the national people had known that, he would not have been able to register here.
It turns out Scouts Canada had been maintaining its own secret list for decades. It called it the Confidential List, a record of men who'd been kicked out of scouting over allegations of sexual abuse. We've learned Richard Turley's name was added to the Canadian list, But even today, Scouts Canada won't say what it knew about him or when.
Before long, the boys in Turley's troop were bragging about the parties they had at their leader's house. Turley has the first home computer and video games they've ever seen, and the boys get the run of the place.
He's got an Atari, and he worked for a candy company, and his cupboard was full of candy. And I mean, it was great. You know, this is where we wanted to go after Scouts.
Gene Bidens is hearing whispers about the parties, rumors that the boys are being offered beer. Turley is also sharing his tent with boys on camping trips.
So I was sort of very suspicious of that. And just little things came to my ears.
Bidens relayed what she heard, but believes Scouting executives were worried there wasn't enough evidence to risk ruining a good man's reputation.
People didn't want to say anything, yes.
And either wreck his reputation or that of Scouting.
Yes.
But it's already too late. Up next, what the Boy Scouts of America knew all along.
That's terrible. That's awful. He thrives on that. Things are being mishandled.
It's 1985, and the boys in Richard Turley's scouting troop are excited. They're going to their first big camping trip on an island off BC's coast. But none of the boys are talking about what's really going on between Turley and Scouts like Jason Davies, who is then just 11.
I guess about a month in, that's when he said, you know, he sit on my lap, and it's more comfortable on lap, and then he started rubbing it back. He didn't think anything of it. Time we're playing video games. I wasn't the only one there. He was doing it to all the other kids. And then I guess about 3 or 4 months in, he started inviting us over for sleepovers.
The boys don't know they're being groomed by a convicted sex offender. Richard Turley has a criminal record for kidnapping a boy, and Turley's name is on a secret list at the headquarters of Boy Scouts of America after admitting to molesting boys in California. The list is supposed to keep him out of scouting. It hasn't. And now he's taking the boys on an overnight trip.
Rick Turley asked if he could sleep with me in a separate area down by the rock, down closer to the water. And then he started talking about body heat keeping people warm. We had to sleep in the nude, and he started touching me in bad places, and then he raped me straight up. That's what happened. That's what I remember. That's something I'll never forget.
A little boy raped in his sleeping bag, while other boys and another parent slept further up the hill. Jason runs to the shore and prays a passing boat will save him.
What's that like for you? To picture that.
It's hard, very difficult. Wanting to swim out to a ferry to get off an island.
Must have been very lonely.
Yeah, it was very lonely. I'm stuck on an island for a weekend, trying to protect my life with Richard Turley.
Jason says he wasn't the only boy in the troop being abused by Turley, but none of them knew who to tell.
Well, I'm not going to say, well, that he touched my penis, and he made me touch his penis, and he kissed me, and, you know, and he grabbed my naked body against his. That's just not something I'm going to say to another scout, because it's embarrassing.
People were getting suspicious. We've learned an assistant scoutmaster complained about the strange goings-on at Turley's home, but the meddling assistant was moved to another troop, and Richard Turley stayed right where he was. It was months later, as rumors that Turley was sleeping with boys in his tent persisted, that Scout House, the regional headquarters, finally asked him to resign.
Jean Bidens, who was the head parent volunteer, was told Turley had been transferred to another troop.
Does it seem like, looking back on it all now, Scout House should have gone to the police and let the police determine whether there was enough evidence, or let the police investigate?
Yes, it should have been handled differently. I don't know exactly what they did at Scout House, but it should have been handled differently. I'd thought about going to the police rather than Scout House, but I thought talking at Scout House would be enough, you know?
We show Bidens what we uncovered. The Boy Scouts of America's perversion file on Turley, written before he arrived in Victoria. And the letter promising victims' families he'll never be allowed near Scouts again.
That's awful. That's terrible. See, it's mishandled there, mishandled here. He thrives on that. Things are being mishandled.
The only person not shocked by Turley's 15-year free reign in scouting is Tim Kosnoff. That's because the U.S. lawyer who first got access to the Boy Scouts of America's entire collection of perversion files says it's a story that repeats itself over and over.
Another example, a letter from a California Boy Scout council that indicates that a scoutmaster was removed in 1956. And it was requested that he be placed in the confidential file, but for some reason he was able to re-register in 1960 in a different troop. Another Turley example.
So what you see is in their own documents evidence of their knowledge and their willful and deliberate effort to keep this a secret from the public, from the police, and from the very people that needed to know the nature and extent of the problem so that they could protect themselves, which were the Scouts themselves.
It's in the mid-1990s, decades after it started keeping a list of pedophiles it had kicked out, that Scouts Canada began a better process to screen its volunteers. It becomes one of the first youth organizations in the country to ask for criminal record checks and references. In a statement sent to the Fifth Estate, Scouts Canada says as far as they can determine, it's always been their policy to take allegations directly to police. Then what happened with Turley, and is he the only one? Questions Tim Kosnoff says have to be asked, because often police weren't told in the United States.
The Boy Scouts of America may be good at woodcraft and outdoor survival skills and so forth, but they do not have the experience, the judgment, or the authority to deal with crimes, which is what they were dealing with here.
So how many cases could there be on Scouts Canada's confidential list? A hint can be found in this country's courthouses. The Fifth Estate spent several months combing through court files to find out how many men who had once been in scouting were later convicted of sex crimes involving children. We discovered about 70 names. The details of what happened in those cases are horrible, but so too is the sheer number of victims. Some of those children were Scouts and some weren't, but our numbers show men who were still involved in scouting together abused more than 300 children.
When we come back,
good morning.
Whatever happened to Richard Turley?
Are you Rick?
I am.
Hi, I'm Diana Swain. I'm with CBC, the Fifth Estate.
Oh, hi.
How are you?
Good.
In 1995, roughly 10 years after he was kicked out of scouting in Victoria, police finally close in on Richard Turley. They record him bragging to an undercover officer he thinks is a child porn producer. Turley boasts about the boys he's abused over the years and says scouting was a good place to find victims. Yet remarkably, with all they suspected, it wasn't anyone from Scouts who finally called police, but Turley's new girlfriend, unsettled by his interest in young boys. At long last, Richard Turley was convicted of abusing 4 children, 3 of them former Scouts, and he was declared a dangerous offender, which should have meant he would spend many years behind bars. Joey Day works hard to keep himself calm when he thinks about Turley. He is one of the men who testified against him. He blames his former Scout leader for changing him from a shy boy into a man who's led a violent life. His tough exterior falls away, though, when he remembers finally telling a childhood friend what happened.
What did it feel like to talk about it, be able to tell
Him
somebody?
and I actually both cried. His father beat the piss out of him. He came from an abusive home. And the guy who sexually abused him was a neighbor down the street. I told him it was my Cub Scout leader. You know, we agreed we're going to kill them both when we got bigger.
Did you dream about that?
Oh, I've had dreams of killing Rick Turley most of my life. Are you kidding me?
Do you still?
I'd love to have him alone for a minute. I'm just getting mad right now. Can you just...
Okay.
Oh, I just want to kill him. Ooh. The abuse.
Jason Davies never wants to see Turley again. He testified too, and he had no idea the man he thought was behind bars for life was in fact released years ago.
So how do you feel about the fact that he's out now?
I didn't know he was out.
He's out.
Nobody contacted me. They were supposed to contact me.
He's been out for a while, actually.
Huh.
Did you think he was going to be staying in for the rest of his life?
I did, yeah. They told me that dangerous offenders usually do.
The dangerous offender status was appealed and dropped.
See, no, I didn't know any of this. Nobody told me at all. The lawyers said that they would contact me before he was let out, and I'd have to write a impact statement before he was let out.
What would you do if you ran into him today?
I'd be scared.
After months of searching, we find Richard Turley living in Alberta, released from prison in 2002 after serving 5 years.
Are you Rick?
I am.
Hi, I'm Diana Swain. I'm with CBC, The Fifth Estate.
Oh, hi.
How are you?
Good, sure.
I'm doing a story on Boy Scouts.
Okay.
And I know that you had a history with the Boy Scouts.
I've done what I did. It happened many, many years ago. I did the time. My offenses, like I say, happened way back in the 80s and 70s. And I haven't offended. I have no plans on ever offending ever again.
Turley tells us he too was a scout and reveals he was abused as a boy by a relative.
I've spoken to Joey Day. I've spoken to Jason Davies, some of the other guys. Is there something you want me to tell them?
I know they're probably still angry. They will be for the rest of their life. I know how they felt because I feel the same way. And their life was changed by me, by a tragic errors that I did.
Were you ever surprised you didn't get caught sooner?
Yeah.
Do you have kids?
No.
Can I ask you, if you had kids, Would you put them in Scouts?
No.
Why not?
Just because of my past.
Because you think it's maybe still going on?
It's still going on.
And years later, the struggle is still going on for Jason. He says the abuse has left him with an anxiety disorder and a string of failed relationships. He had never seen until we showed him that Turley's name was on file with Boy Scouts of America years before he and many others were abused.
If somebody had acted on this in 1979...
It never would have happened, yeah. Yeah, it never would have happened. Then, yeah, they could have stopped us if they wanted to. I believe that. And that's not good. That pisses me off.
When did Scouts Canada find out Turley's name was on the American list? They won't say. Instead, Scouts likes to focus on what it views as the intense screening of volunteers that it now requires. CEO Janet Yale has been with Scouts Canada for about a year. She declined to be interviewed for our story.
Scouts Canada sent us a statement, but it doesn't answer the central questions. How many Richard Turleys are still out there? And do they have any information that wasn't shared with police? The answers are under lock and key at Scouts Canada's head office in Ottawa. Miss Yale? Miss Yale, I'm Diana Swain from CBC. Can I have a minute of your time?
We wanted to put our questions to Janet Yale, who refers to the American files as the pink files.
But we do want to talk about the confidential files as a whole, and whether Scouts Canada has ever taken that entire contents of files and given them to the police and let them see if there's evidence of crimes that haven't been investigated there, going all the way back to the beginning of time when they started collecting the files.
Well, I think our statement makes it clear that we don't have pink files. The only files we have of a confidential nature relate to people who have been suspended or terminated.
Right.
And so that is a difference between us and the Boy Scouts of America.
But in terminating some of those people for reasons that you were concerned about their behavior with Scouts, has that information going all the way back to the beginning of the time collecting them?
As I said, the only files we have are with respect to people who have been suspended or terminated because of our policy, which is to suspend first and then investigate. We do not have pink files like the Boy Scouts of America.
No, I understand that.
She refused to answer whether what Scouts Canada did collect has been passed to police.
I'm not sure what further you're looking for because we don't have
But my question is actually
files.
quite specific. And I'm quite anxious to hear the answer to the specific question.
I think I've answered your question.
But I don't think you have.
I don't think you're satisfied with my answer.
I don't understand your answer, and I really do want to take the time to make sure that we do understand what you're saying. On the files, has that information been given to the police?
Days later, she sent a written statement insisting nothing is withheld from police. The Fifth Estate has found more than a dozen civil cases accusing Scouts Canada of failing to protect children from abuse. Most of the cases have been quietly settled out of court, keeping the stories out of the headlines. U.S. lawyer Tim Kosnoff believes it's time for the secrecy to stop.
It's the same immoral behavior that led to the abuse in the first instance. They want these victims to go away. They don't want to help them. They want to silence them forever. This is about the Boy Scouts' dirty little secrets, and they want to continue to keep them secret.
That's the only thing that really scares me, is they're going to try to offer me, they're going to try to offer me money or something in hopes that I'll keep it quiet.
And what if they do that? What if they try and do that? What are you going to do?
It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
The Boy Scouts of America have paid out millions in very public lawsuits since lawyers like Kosnoff got access to the perversion files.
Did you testify in court?
Yeah, I testified with one other person.
What was that experience like?
just a frightening thing, but I knew if I didn't get up there and do it, you know, I knew it would just make a difference. And that's why I did it.
And what happened to him?
He got sent to prison for 10 years to life.
The stories of crimes committed against young boys, hidden in those files and long covered up, have left their mark on the U.S. legal system and on Kosnoff.
They're hard stories to hear. It's hard, you know, it's one thing to hear it on TV. It's another thing to sit across from someone who looks you in the eye and tells you that they were raped, and they were raped again the next week and the next week. You know, you've had a successful career. You don't have to expose yourself to this anymore. You don't have to hear these kinds of stories anymore. Why do you do it?
I don't know, but I can't stop. I always know that those days are going to be rough days. It makes me sad. It makes me angry. And it makes me feel like if I don't give a damn, you know, who will?
Tim Kosnoff believes Scouts Canada has done more than its American counterpart to screen out pedophiles. But he's come to believe the very nature of Scouting is what makes it vulnerable. He says it's time to make those lists count for something more than they have, and for Scouts in the U.S. and Canada to finally come clean about what they knew and when.